A tale of the San Juan Mountains. Some stories entertain you, but some stories stay with you. If this one made you feel something, that's not by accident. Because here, we don't tell ordinary stories. We tell stories about freedom, courage, and the kind of love that never tries to control you. So if you're tired of empty content and you want stories that actually mean something, hit subscribe, US Wild West Love Story, and walk this journey with us. Because the next story might change the way you see everything. Blood on the Snow tells a story most men ignore. When Gideon Hayes tracked a wounded elk through the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains in the bitter winter of 1883, he expected to find a carcass. Instead, he found a footprint, a small, delicate boot heel. Someone was surviving the impossible. Winter in the Colorado Territory did not forgive. It was a brutal howling force that swallowed men whole, burying their ambitions under 10 feet of powder. Gideon Hayes knew this better than anyone. At 42, he was a man carved from the very granite of the Rockies with a beard thick as a bear's pelt and eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. He had retreated to these high altitudes a decade prior, leaving behind the bloody memories of the war and the bustling, deceitful streets of Denver. Up here, a man's survival depended entirely on his own two hands. It was late November when the unnatural scent of green wood smoke drifted across the ridge. Gideon tightened his grip on his Winchester rifle, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The smoke was rising from the old Cochrane claim, a dilapidated prospector's cabin tucked into the crook of a narrow ravine. Old man Cochrane had died of mountain fever 6 years ago, and the roof had been steadily caving in ever since. It was no place for a traveler, and a seasoned outlaw would know better than to burn green pine which smoked like a signal fire against the pale sky. Moving with the silent, deliberate grace of a predator, Gideon navigated the treacherous slope. He expected to find a foolish greenhorn, or perhaps a desperate claim jumper who had lost his way. What he saw when he parted the heavy boughs of the blue spruce made his calloused hands freeze. A woman. She was violently swinging a rusted, half-broken axe at a frozen stump. She wore a man's heavy wool coat that swallowed a small frame, the hem dragging in the snow. Her hands were wrapped in torn strips of burlap, and even from 40 yards away, Gideon could see the violent shivering racking her body. She was starving, exhausted, and wholly out of her depth. Gideon observed her for a long hour. The laws of the mountain dictated that you minded your own business. Helping a stranger often meant taking on their demons. Or worse, sharing your own scarce rations until you both starved. But as she dropped the axe and collapsed to her knees in the snow, weeping silently into her burlap-wrapped hands, a ghost of a conscience stirred within his chest. He stepped out from the tree line. The crunch of his boots on the crusty snow was deafening in the quiet valley. The woman's head snapped up. In a flash of panicked desperation, she scrambled backward, her hands digging frantically into the oversized pockets of her coat. By the time Gideon took his third step, she had produced a heavy, rusted Colt Patterson revolver. She gripped it with both hands, the barrel trembling wildly as she aimed it at his chest. "Stay exactly where you are," she screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. "I swear to God, I'll put a hole right through you." Gideon stopped. He didn't raise his rifle, but he didn't lower it either. He looked at her closely. Beneath the soot, dirt, and terror, she possessed a striking aristocratic bone structure, features that belonged in a velvet-draped parlor in Boston, not freezing to death in a forgotten canyon. "That hammer's rusted shut, ma'am," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for conversation in months. "Even if it wasn't, your hands are shaking too hard to hit a barn from the inside." She blinked, her breath hitching, but she didn't lower the weapon. "Who sent you? Was it Josiah? Tell him I'll die before I go back." "Josiah." Gideon filed the name away. "Nobody sent me. I live up the ridge." "Saw your smoke." He slowly unslung a brace of freshly trapped snowshoe hairs from his shoulder and tossed them into the snow halfway between them. They landed with a soft thud. "You're burning green wood. It'll choke you in your sleep and draw every hungry wolf within 10 miles. I'll leave some dry kindling on the stump." He didn't wait for her permission. Keeping his eyes on her, he backed up to the tree line, chopped a deadfall branch into neat dry logs with a few practice swings of his hatchet, and stacked them on the stump. "Don't come back," she yelled, though the gun barrel finally dipped a fraction of an inch. "If I don't, you'll be dead by Tuesday," Gideon replied flatly. He turned his back to her, a calculated risk, and disappeared into the heavy timber. He didn't return to his own cabin right away. Instead, he climbed to a vantage point on the bluff and watched. He watched as she cautiously approached the dead hares, kicking them first as if they might spring back to life before snatching them up along with the dry wood. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange, silent routine formed. Gideon became her unseen guardian. He never approached the cabin while she was outside, but every morning, Abigail, as he would later learn her name was, would open her door to find provisions left on the stump. A flank of venison wrapped in clean cloth, a pouch of salt, a box of dry matches, a heavy wool blanket. In return, she began leaving small tokens on the stump, a polished river stone, a perfectly preserved blue jay feather. It was a silent conversation, a tentative bridge of trust built across the freezing expanse of the wilderness. But Gideon knew the mountain was just waiting. The skies were turning the color of bruised iron, and the air held the sharp taste of an impending blizzard. The old Cochrane cabin wouldn't survive a heavy snow load, and neither would she. The great storm of '83 hit the San Juans with the fury of a vengeful god. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind screamed through the canyons, driving a blinding wall of white powder that buried landmarks and froze the sap inside the trees. Up in his fortified log cabin, built to withstand the worst of the Rockies, Gideon paced the floorboards. The fire roared in the hearth, but a cold knot sat heavy in his stomach. The old prospector's cabin down the ravine had a rotting ridgepole. He knew it wouldn't hold. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind broke just enough for a man to stand without being blown over. Gideon strapped on his bare paw snowshoes, wrapped himself in a heavy buffalo robe, and began the treacherous descent. The snow was chest-high in places, the cold so severe it felt like needles driving into his lungs. When he reached the crook of the ravine, his worst fears were realized. The Cochrane cabin was gone. In its place was a massive smooth mound of snow. The roof had caved in under the immense weight. Panic, a strange and unfamiliar emotion, seized Gideon's chest. He threw off his heavy robe and began digging frantically with his hands and a wooden snow shovel he had slung across his back. "Hey!" he roared over the wind. "Hey!" He hit splintered wood. Ripping away the rotting cedar shakes, he broke through into the dark, freezing interior. The main beam had snapped, crushing the rickety bed and the small stove. He crawled into the dark, his hands frantically sweeping the debris. He found her wedged in the small triangle of space beneath the collapsed dining table. She was unconscious, her lips blue, her skin icy to the touch. The fire had gone out hours ago. Gideon didn't hesitate. He wrapped her entirely in his buffalo robe, hoisted her over his broad shoulder, and began the brutal, agonizing climb back up the mountain. It took him 3 hours to traverse a distance that usually took 30 minutes. By the time he kicked his own door open, his vision was tunneling, his muscles screaming in agony. He laid her out on his thick bearskin rug by the roaring fire. He worked methodically, peeling away her frozen wet clothes, replacing them with his own dry flannels, and wrapping her in thick wool blankets. He heated stones in the fire and placed them at her feet and beneath her arms, trying to force the warmth back into her core. For 2 days, she hovered between life and death. The mountain fever took hold and she thrashed wildly in delirium. "Josiah, don't," she whimpered one night, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the log ceiling. "The ledger. I saw the ledger. It wasn't a train wreck. You killed them." Gideon, sitting by the hearth carving a piece of pine to stay awake, stopped his knife. He listened. "Pinkertons won't stop," she muttered, gripping the blankets until her knuckles turned white. $80,000 blood money. "I won't let you." Gideon wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth. The pieces were falling into place. She wasn't just a widow running from grief. She was running from a massacre. On the 3rd morning, the fever finally broke. Gideon was boiling a pot of black coffee when he heard a sharp intake of breath behind him. He turned to see her sitting up, clutching the blankets to her chest, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar, heavily fortified cabin. Her gaze landed on the wall, where an arsenal of repeating rifles and hunting knives hung with military precision. "You're in my home," Gideon said gently, keeping his distance. "Your roof collapsed in the storm. You've been out for 3 days." She stared at him, the memory of the freezing darkness slowly washing over her face. She looked down at the oversized flannel shirt she was wearing, then back at him. "You saved my life," she whispered. "Was it much of a life you were living down there?" Gideon said, pouring a cup of coffee and bringing it to her. He set it on the small table next to the bed. "My name is Gideon Hayes." She hesitated, then picked up the mug, letting the heat seep into her palms. "Abigail. Abigail Trenton." "Well, Mrs. Trenton," Gideon said, pulling up a wooden chair and leaning forward. "You talked quite a bit when you've got a fever. You talked about a man named Josiah. You talked about a train wreck, $80,000 and a ledger." Abigail's eyes widened in sheer terror. She practically spilled the coffee as she scrambled back against the headboard. "I'm not going to hurt you," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "But if trouble is coming up my mountain, I need to know what kind. You said Josiah sent men. Who is he?" Abigail searched his eyes. She saw the rugged harshness, the scars of a violent past, but she also saw the man who had left her food in the snow. The man who had dug her out of a collapsed grave. She took a shuddering breath. Josiah is my husband. He is the chief enforcer for the Western Pacific Railroad. 6 months ago, a payroll train derailed near Durango. 10 men died. Everyone thought it was an accident, but I found his ledger. He engineered the crash to steal the payroll. He didn't know I saw it. She reached over to her wet, ruined coat hanging by the fire. With trembling fingers, she ripped open the heavy wool lining. From deep within the fabric, she pulled out a small, black, leather-bound book. This is the proof. If this gets to the federal marshals in Denver, he hangs. She looked up at Gideon, tears finally spilling over her lashes. He put a bounty on my head. He told his men I stole the money. He sent 2 of his worst killers, Caleb and Dutch, to track me. They won't stop until I'm dead. This ledger is burned. Gideon stared at the black book. He left the corrupt world of men behind a long time ago, seeking peace in the high country. But looking at Abigail, he realized peace was a luxury the world rarely afforded. Before he could answer, a sound cut through the crisp morning air outside. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the cry of a hawk. It was the sharp, unmistakable snap of a dry branch breaking under a horse's hoof. Gideon stood up instantly, moving to the window. He peered through the thick frost on the glass. Down the ridge, at the edge of his property line, the fresh snow was disturbed. The tracks were deep, and they weren't made by wild game. They were the distinct iron-shod prints of city horses. They had found her. Stay low and away from the windows, Gideon commanded, his voice devoid of panic but laced with a lethal calmness. He moved with practiced efficiency, pulling a Winchester 1873 from the wall rack and checking the lever action. Gideon shoved a heavy oak table against the heavy oak door. He then turned to a hidden floorboard near the hearth, prying it up to reveal a cache of ammunition and a meticulously oiled double-barrel shotgun. The peaceful isolation he had fought so hard to cultivate was evaporating with every crunch of approaching boots on the snow crust outside. Abigail scrambled to the far corner of the cabin, clutching the black ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. It's Caleb and Dutch, Josiah's hounds. They found me. They found my property, Gideon corrected, slipping extra cartridges into the deep pockets of his wool trousers. He walked over to her, kneeling so they were eye to level. He pulled a beautifully maintained Colt single-action Army from his holster and placed it in her trembling hands. This one isn't rusted, pointed at the door. If a man steps through that isn't me, you pull the trigger, and you don't stop until it clicks empty. Understand? Abigail swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening around the walnut grip. I brought death to your door, Mr. Hayes. I am so sorry. Death's been knocking on my door since Gettysburg, Mrs. Trenton. I just usually don't invite him inside. Gideon offered a tight, reassuring nod, then moved to the small, heavily shuttered window facing the ridge. He peered through a narrow slit in the wood. 2 men on horseback were struggling through the chest-high drifts about 50 yards away. They were heavily armed, wearing thick buffalo coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the biting wind. Gideon recognized the type immediately. Pinkerton rejects, men who killed for a payroll and slept soundly afterward. Ho! The cabin! A voice boomed across the frozen expanse, the sound muffled by the wind. It was the taller of the 2, a man with a scarred cheek and a Spencer carbine resting casually across his saddle pommel. This was likely Caleb. We know you got the woman in there, mountain man. Hand her over, and we ride away. We only want the thief. Gideon didn't bother shouting back. Parleying with hired guns was a fool's errand. Instead, he calculated the windage, raised the Winchester, and fired a warning shot that took the hat clean off Caleb's head. The response was instantaneous. The 2 men spurred their horses behind the cover of a massive granite outcropping and unleashed a hail of lead. Bullets tore through the thick timber of Gideon's cabin, shattering the frost-covered glass and embedding themselves in the log walls. The noise was deafening in the confined space. Gideon dropped to one knee, waiting for a lull in their volley. When the firing paused, likely as one of them reloaded, Gideon kicked the heavy oak door open just enough to step out into the freezing storm. He moved like a ghost through the snow, using the dense cover of the blue spruce trees flanking his porch. Dutch, the second man, had foolishly broken cover to flank the cabin. He was trudging through a deep drift, his revolver drawn. Gideon didn't hesitate. He leveled the Winchester and fired twice. The reports echoed like thunderclaps across the canyon. Dutch dropped the revolver, clutching his shoulder with a sharp cry, and crumpled into the snow, thrashing blindly. Suddenly, a searing heat ripped through Gideon's left side. Caleb had circled higher up the ridge and caught Gideon in his sights. The heavy bullet tore through Gideon's thick coat and grazed his ribs, knocking the wind out of them. Gideon pitched forward into the snow, biting back a groan of agony as the white powder around him instantly bloomed crimson. "Gideon!" Abigail screamed from inside the cabin. "Stay inside!" Gideon roared back, forcing himself up onto his knees. Caleb was advancing down the ridge, racking the lever of his carbine for a finishing shot. Gideon was pinned down, his rifle half buried in the snow, his left arm refusing to obey his commands. He drew a hunting knife with his right hand, preparing for a brutal, close-quarters end. But the finishing shot never came. Instead, a deafening explosion roared from the doorway of the cabin. Abigail stood there, the heavy Colt bucking violently in her hands. She had rested the barrel against the doorframe to steady her trembling arms. The shot was a wild one, but it struck the bark of a pine tree mere inches from Caleb's face, showering him with razor-sharp wooden shrapnel. Caleb staggered backward, clutching his bleeding face. Panicked and blinded by the wood splinters, he lost his footing on the icy slope and tumbled down into the ravine, disappearing into the heavy brush. Silence descended on the mountain once more, save for the howling wind. Gideon stumbled back into the cabin, collapsing onto the heavy wooden chair by the fire. He clamped a blood-soaked hand over his ribs. Abigail dropped the revolver and rushed to his side, her eyes wide with terror. "You're shot," she gasped, her hands hovering uselessly over his bleeding side. "Through and through." "Missed the lung," Gideon gritted out, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. "Get my kit." Black leather bag under the bed. "Boil some water." For the next hour the roles were reversed. Abigail, the refined city woman who had been freezing to death days prior, became the surgeon. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, her hand steadying as the gravity of the situation anchored her. She stitched the torn flesh with needle and thread, apologizing profusely with every flinch Gideon made. "You didn't have to step out there," Abigail whispered as she finished wrapping his torso in clean white bandages. "You could have handed me over." Gideon looked at her, his breathing shallow but steady. "A man is only as good as the lines he refuses to cross, Abigail. Sending a woman back to a butcher is a line I won't cross." A heavy, poignant silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the hearth. In that moment, surrounded by bullet holes and the scent of gunpowder, a profound bond was forged. It wasn't just survival, it was a shared defiance against a corrupt world. "Caleb isn't dead," Gideon said quietly, breaking the tension. "He'll regroup, he'll go down to Telluride, wire Josiah, and come back with 10 men instead of 1. We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" she asked, looking at the black ledger sitting on the table. "We take that book to the one man in Colorado who can't be bought by the railroad," Gideon replied, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to Denver. We're going to see U.S. Marshal David Cook." 2 days later, the blizzard broke, leaving the San Juan Mountains buried under a pristine, treacherous blanket of white. Gideon, heavily bandaged and riding through a haze of pain, saddled his 2 sturdy mountain mules. They packed light ammunition, dried meat, and the ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The descent was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. They had to break trail through untouched snow, constantly scanning the tree lines for Caleb's return. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on them, but Abigail never complained. She rode with her jaw set, the oversized buffalo coat swallowing her frame, her eyes scanning the horizon. They bypassed Durango entirely, knowing Josiah's men would be watching the train station. Instead, Gideon led them east through the unforgiving Wolf Creek Pass, aiming for the railhead at Alamosa, where they could catch a northbound train to Denver without drawing the railroad enforcers' attention. It took them 7 days to reach the lowlands. By the time they saw the smokestacks of Alamosa in the distance, they looked like ghosts. But Josiah Trenton had not become the chief enforcer of the Western Pacific Railroad by being foolish. He knew the geography, and he knew a man like Gideon Hayes would avoid obvious traps. As they approached the outskirts of the rail yard, seeking the cover of the loading docks, the trap sprang. 3 men stepped out from behind the stack of timber. In the center stood Josiah. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit and a bowler hat, looking entirely out of place in the grimy rail yard. Beside him was Caleb, his face heavily bandaged from Abigail's warning shot. "Abigail, my dear," Josiah called out, his voice smooth and terribly calm. "You have caused the company a great deal of expense." Gideon reined his mule to a halt, his hand resting casually near the stock of his Winchester. "You're a long way from a boardroom, Trenton, and you're a long way from your mountain, mister." "Hayes," Josiah replied, his eyes cold and flat. "Hand over the ledger. I'll let you ride back up to your snowbank. The woman comes with me." "I'd rather burn in hell, Josiah," Abigail shouted, her voice trembling but unbroken. Josiah sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Kill the mountain man. Take my wife alive." Caleb raised his rifle, but Gideon was faster. Even wounded, his muscle memory was flawless. Gideon drew his Colt and fired, striking the man to Josiah's left in the chest. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the rail yard, sending workers scattering for cover. Gideon threw himself off his mule, pulling Abigail down behind a stack of steel rails. Bullets sparked against the metal, showering them with hot iron flakes. Gideon returned fire, but he was pinned. His wounded side was burning, slowing his reflexes. "Gideon, the ledger!" Abigail yelled over the gunfire. She shoved the black book into his hands. "If we both die here, it burns. You have to run." "I'm not leaving you," Gideon roared, ejecting empty shells and reloading by feel. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed above them. Caleb had climbed atop the railcar behind them, aiming his rifle squarely at Gideon's back. "Say goodnight, mountain man," Caleb sneered. Gideon twisted, but the angle was impossible. He couldn't bring his gun up in time. A single shot rang out. It wasn't Gideon's gun, and it wasn't Caleb's rifle. Caleb's eyes went wide, his rifle slipping from his grasp as he pitched forward, falling off the railcar and landing heavily in the dirt. Gideon looked to his side. Abigail was holding a small silver derringer she had hidden in her boot. Smoke curling from the barrel. She had saved his life. Again, with Caleb down, the odds shifted. Josiah, seeing his men falling and his leverage evaporating, panicked. He turned and sprinted toward a waiting carriage at the end of the yard. "He's getting away!" Abigail cried. Gideon rose, leaning against the steel rails, his breathing ragged. He leveled his Winchester, tracking Josiah's fleeing form. But before he could pull the trigger, a chaotic shout erupted from the opposite end of the yard. A squad of heavily armed men on horseback flooded into the loading area, wearing the silver stars of the federal government. At their lead was a broad-supported man with a legendary mustache. "Throw down your weapons, by order of Marshal David Cook." The man bellowed. Josiah froze, raising his hands in defeat. The federal marshals swarmed him, dragging him to the dirt. Gideon lowered his rifle, the adrenaline finally leaving his system in a sudden, exhausting rush. He slumped against the steel rails, sliding down into the dirt. Abigail was instantly at his side, her arms wrapping around his neck. Marshal Cook trotted his horse over to where they sat in the dirt, looking down at the bloody, battered mountain man and the woman holding him. "Gideon Hayes," Marshal Cook said, shaking his head. "I got a telegraph from a friendly station master in Telluride, saying a ghost from the mountains was riding out with the devil on his heels. I see the rumors were true." Gideon weakly reached into his coat and pulled out the black ledger, holding it up toward the marshal. "I believe you'll find the devil's bookkeeping in here, David." Gideon never returned to the lonely cabin in the San Juans. With Josiah hanged for the payroll massacre, the bounty was lifted. Gideon and Abigail used the railroad reward money to purchase a sprawling horse ranch in the golden valleys of the Front Range. The mountain man traded his isolation for a fierce, enduring love, proving that even the coldest winters eventually yield to the warmth of spring. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Please, like this video to show your support for stories of true courage. Share this with someone who needs to believe in love and freedom today. And don't forget to subscribe to US Wild West Love Story so you never miss a journey into the wild. We'll see you in the next one.